Welcome to the Downlink Media Insights on the satellite and space industry. I'm your host, Kathy Stershic with W2 Communications. I am the resident space geek at the firm, and with me today are distinguished journalists covering the exciting space and satellite sector. We have Rachel Jewett, Senior Managing Editor of Via Satellite, Vivienne Machi, Military Space Editor for Aviation Week, Mike Gruss, Chief Content and Strategy Officer at SpaceNews, and Marjorie Censer, Editor-in-Chief at Aerospace America. At the end, if we can, we'll try to save a little bit of time for audience questions, but for now, I am thrilled to welcome the panel, and let's get started. I don't know about you guys, but I am still feeling the Artemis joy. That was a real highlight of my month. But we also just had the Satellite 2026 conference in March and Space Symposium just 2 weeks ago. So these are really about the two biggest shows of the year in our world. How would you compare the vibe from this year to last year? Who'd like to start?
I'll start. So there's some tough questions here, Kathy. So I'm going to take the easy ones where I can and leave the tough ones. But, I think particularly the vibe at Symposium this year, very, very optimistic. I think it came on the heels of the budget announcement, particularly for the Space Force, which is a giant number. I think there's a lot of optimism around Golden Dome, a lot of money there. So while there are still questions, I think there are a lot of folks, particularly on the show floor, who see that they have a chance at maybe making some inroads into the Department of Defense, maybe getting some of this $70 billion, and that's encouraging to them. I think if you're going to compare it to last year, particularly satellite, but also Symposium, there was DOGE was much more top of mind. I think there were a lot of questions about what budgets would look like, how many federal workers there would be. The NASA budget was obviously, or the NASA budget request from the White House was obviously a big cut last year, a big cut again this year. I think folks are still cognizant of that. I think there's still questions about how all of this funding has to go through. And it's not complete optimism. It's not unbridled joy, but I think people generally feel very, very good. And that's about as close to a 180 as you can get from a year ago.
Marjorie, what was your experience?
Well, I have to caveat that I did not go last year, so I can't compare, but I would agree with Mike that Space Symposium, I think there was a lot of optimism, and I would cite two main things. One, that Space Force budget and seeing kind of the growth that is being forecast. And two, I think Artemis, there's just a sort of a sense of optimism and possibility by that. And I also think, when there's mainstream interest in the topic that people work on, I do think that kind of is heartening to them, right? Suddenly maybe their neighbors or their friends want to talk about it too. So I think that that was something that I got out of it, even if I can't quite compare. But certainly I think the vibe that Mike is describing from early 2025, that I think was present in other conferences that I was at.
Rachel, I know you were at Satellite because I saw you there. I'm not sure about Symposium.
Yes,
what do you think?
Yes, I was at both shows. Yeah, I think that kind of like what Mike was saying, that uncertainty was kind of a theme of last year. There was a lot of uncertainty at both shows about what changes were going to mean for the industry. And I think there was a lot more enthusiasm and momentum overall this year. People seem to be very positive in conversations that I was having of people are making inroads, business is going well. There's a lot of demand going around, whether that's from Space Force, connectivity demand. Also, I would say international, the demand for sovereign space and nations in Europe making greater investments into defense and space technology. So I definitely felt like there was a lot of momentum and enthusiasm at those shows this year.
Vivienne, were you able to attend?
I was at both as well. And I mean, not to foot stomp what the rest of my colleagues have already said, but, my focus is on military space at Aviation Week. So certainly I would describe the vibe as jubilant, honestly, at Space Symposium regarding the increased Space Force budget proposal. I mean, talking about proposing $19 billion in procurement as opposed to less than $4 billion in 2026 and more than or nearly $41 billion in research and development. I mean, that is still small dollars compared to the rest of the defense budget, let's be clear. But for space, that is just a huge number that I don't even know if people were necessarily expecting it to be that big at this point. But I would also say, in terms of the sovereign space topic that Rachel touched upon, I did sense a bit of perplexity from some of the international partners at both Satellite and Space Symposium, kind of just about the confusion between rhetoric coming from higher up in the Trump administration with regards to allies and partnerships and how that translates down to the actual programs and what sort of involvement there might be for international allies at the base level for space technologies. So that was definitely something I picked up on both conferences as well.
Was there any particular moment that stood out for any of you at either event or something in the news? For Marjorie.
I think on my end, I would say one topic I've been covering for the past couple of years is on-orbit mobility and sort of maneuverable spacecraft. And that's something that there is still not a lot of budget dollars around for the Space Force in particular. However, I did notice that there was just a lot more talk and a lot more upfront discussion from vendors at Space Symposium and also Satellite, talking about debuting new spacecraft, really answering a call that some senior Space Force leaders have been making over the past couple of years, even if they haven't been making big dollar investments around it. So I thought the conversation around on-orbit mobility was a big change compared to last year.
Okay. Any standout?
One of the interesting things for me was Amazon's acquisition of Globalstar, which was a big rumor going around during the satellite show of whether or not Globalstar was going to get acquired and who was going to acquire them. And then it came out during Space Symposium, and it's not really related as much to the focus of Space Symposium. And like with the Amazon Leo team there, they're focused on their constellation, and this is a separate initiative from Amazon. So and I think we're going to be talking more about spectrum issues in this conversation, but that was a big piece of news for me.
Mike, any surprises?
I don't know if there were surprises. I think what's happened is, this, as Vivienne mentioned, I think there's been this gradual change and probably going back 10 years, but it takes pretty steep steps. I think sometimes talking about space as a warfighting domain, I think the on-orbit, the maneuverability discussion that particularly came from General Whiting, I think that's just another step in that rhetoric. I think that was also evident on the show floor. There was more and more discussion of not necessarily counter space, but that, hey, that space is a military domain, that there could be attacks, that this isn't just defend. And I think for a long time that was not part of the discussion, obviously, with the Space Force, and there's certainly folks leaning into that. I think if I don't know that there's one moment, but I think probably thematically the other thing, both at Satellite and Symposium, is just this focus, relentless focus on speed. I think it's a little bit. I think it's one of these things that comes up every year, and everyone says we have to go faster. But I think this year was maybe one of the first years where the Space Force in particular, but also NASA, could point to some tangible steps about how they are accelerating acquisitions and maybe the progress that it's making. So that's something I heard a lot about on the show floor, and I think we're going to continue to see a lot of acquisition changes. Not always as exciting as an Artemis 2 splashdown, but I do think it's something that a lot of folks in the industry are talking about.
That's great. Getting up toward warp speed. So I want to maybe drill down on a few different areas then, because I know you guys have very broad perspectives on what's going on. Let's start with the economics about LEO and what's going on with broadband at the moment. Is this actually becoming like a durable business model with mega constellations? Are we getting there?
I mean, it absolutely is for SpaceX and Starlink.
Yes.
The past year has only reinforced the success of Starlink, and we've seen how deep roads it's made, particularly in the aviation sector, how the subscriber count. So, I mean, in terms of Starlink, and it's been a couple of years, I think, since that's been up for question, but that's not up for question anymore. And I think we're about to see a little bit more competition in the LEO broadband market, particularly with Amazon is, racing to get that constellation up, trying to move into service later this year. And I think there's going to be some interesting tie-ins just with the constellation being tied into Amazon, and whether that's Amazon Web Services or the Amazon retail empire overall. I think that's going to add a really interesting element. Telesat has, they're working to get that constellation up. And they've talked about having a lot of demand as well, even though it'll be a little bit more time. And then I would also say that there are a couple of other interesting competitors that are doing something in maybe a different way that aren't deployed yet, but that I'm following and very interested in. A couple of those would be like Logo Space and Spin Launch with the Meridian Space constellation. Those are some just some different avenues of looking at LEO constellations that I've been interested in.
Okay. Marjorie?
I'm
sorry. Go ahead.
I'd just add to that quickly. I think there's also two super mega constellations, whatever adjectives we want to put in front of them, in China that are being discussed too, of 100,000 plus satellites. So I think there's a lot of talk right now about all this. There's a lot to see how this business model works out. As Rachel said, Starlink is far and away ahead of everyone, but the thing to keep in mind too on all of this is launch, and that we hear a lot about thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites in filings, but it's very difficult to find the launch capacity for all that, and that's going to be a difficult issue for almost everyone except for maybe SpaceX and maybe Amazon or Blue Origin here going forward. But it's going to be tough for a lot of folks to get all these satellites in orbit.
The guys who own the rockets. Yeah. Marjorie, are you seeing any new influence from LEO in your world?
I mean, for the mega constellation thing is something we're tracking like everybody else, right?
Sure.
I think we're interested in, a lot of elements on it. We had one piece that we're looking at, kind of how to avoid collisions. There's these emerging issues that are sort of like trying to go down the path of, if this comes to fruition, then what? So that's certainly something we're tracking, less so from a business perspective and more from a technological perspective.
Okay, great. No, that makes total sense. Vivienne, anything to add?
I would say, the key mega constellation on the military space side is the Space Development Agency's proliferated warfighter space architecture that's been in the works for the past 6 years now. And I guess my thought on, related to the economics is that the SDA model definitely was an inspiration for a lot of other nations and departments to really think about how can we build a more resilient space architecture for both data and connectivity, and also for missile warning and missile tracking. And we're seeing some of those influences in even Golden Dome, which is considering the SDA's tracking layer to be a key part of its architecture. But what's interesting about what's happening to the SDA right now is that architecture is kind of morphing as the Defense Department is changing its acquisition structure. And we might potentially see the Space Development Agency itself be dismantled or sort of just, again, morphed in a different way as that happens. So it's kind of interesting to see, the architecture that the agency was stood up to build might, continue in a different way or under different agencies, but the agency itself might not exist as we know it today.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you. So I know a few names have been put out already. Is there anybody that you think looks particularly stronger now than they did, say, 6 months ago? And is there anybody that you think is starting to look vulnerable? Any of the operators or providers? Don't want to name names. It's okay.
I mean, I think
I feel
I guess I'll
this is more a
start.
question for the commercial people on the panel. Sorry, Mike.
No. I think what I was going to say is, obviously again, Rachel's probably best suited to talk about this, but I think the winners are going to be the folks with Spectrum, right? That's what we're seeing, where the currency is right now, particularly in SATCOM, and so, the between Spectrum and launch, those are the two ways that seem most apparent to make yourself a winner. And I think the folks that have that are probably in the best position.
Does anyone think we're going to start seeing a consolidation phase? Small set manufacturers, startups, any of that going to start consolidating?
I would be curious to hear others' thoughts on in terms of small sat manufacturers. I mean, I think that we've seen that already take place in terms of the big SATCOM operators. So Eutelsat buying OneWeb, Viasat buying Inmarsat, then the big SES Intelsat, and now we're kind of seeing what that consolidation is meaning for the operators. So I've asked others' opinions on, do you think that we'll see more at this point among those big operators? And for mostly what I'm hearing is no, but that is having some knock-on effects down the technology stack and for the business models of, whether that's the ground providers, other parts of the ecosystem. But then obviously we've seen Globalstar get acquired just this past week. So there could always be more.
Yeah, I think I think the sense right now is that there's an awful lot of space companies, and that particularly with the size of contract awards, it could be difficult for all of them to either ramp up to the pace that the government wants or that the market demands. And so that, sure, that there could be more mergers and acquisitions, that it's probably even likely to continue this trend that we're on, but I don't, it's like anything else. We'll see.
Okay. There's been a lot of hype so far around satellite to phone, direct to device. The capability is here, but what has to happen for that to become real revenue and not just an emergency use basis kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kathy. I think that will people be willing to pay for it is really the big question here. And actually, T-Mobile's CEO spoke about that this week on their investor call, and he said that they're seeing less take up than they expected. So I am not paying extra for a direct to device. I don't wouldn't need it often enough to justify that. And I almost wonder if it's just if it could become expected that it's a safety feature, but will people be actually willing to pay for it? Some are saying yes, they will, but personally, I have doubts on how much people will be willing to pay for that extra service.
We need a killer app. What's the killer app for this?
I mean, it's safety, it's the reliability and just knowing that it's there when you need it. And that is something that people might just expect, and they might not be willing to pay extra in anticipation of needing it in a safety situation. Which is why, the Apple thing where it's just built into the phone at a basic level, that really makes sense to me.
Other thoughts?
From a military perspective, I've definitely heard the Space Force express interest in direct-to-device, especially where it can help, fill in some coverage gaps that they have in current areas of operation. But the way I hear senior leaders talk about it is there's interest, but certainly not something that they would look to invest in themselves until the commercial, usage is higher. And to Rachel's point and to Mike's point, there's until all of these satellites are launched, until that capability is proven out, it's really hard to say what sort of applications it can meaningfully have, and especially for the military in this context.
Okay. So it sounds like there's still a bit of wait and see going on. Are there regulatory hurdles? Is anything underestimated there, you think?
I think that's when we get into the spectrum discussion of owning the spectrum yourself versus using the mobile network operator spectrum, which is the supplemental coverage from space with the FCC, which is, that's a framework that the FCC has adopted. I think globally, there are certain constraints where it's easier to adopt on an island or a country that is a very large landmass. But for smaller nations, it's more difficult to adopt. So I think in terms of the global rollout, there are still regulatory things at play. But we are really seeing more interest in doing it with satellite spectrum in MSS spectrum, where the ownership of that spectrum is really critical.
How much of the AI boom do you think is dependent on satellite? Especially LEO. I mean, talk about putting data centers in space. So that's a whole nother dimension. But, at the moment, there's an awful lot of transactions that need to be going back and forth.
I'm going to take that opportunity as a free plug because SpaceNews is hosting an event tomorrow on orbital data centers. So thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome, Mike.
But I think the AI boom has probably already started, and is probably one of my takeaways from Symposium was that adoption is probably further along than I think I realized, and maybe many of us realize. One of the conversations I had repeatedly was about I don't want to say a new field, but almost going back to double check the work that AI has done, that the rigor to applying that same level of rigor that they would to engineering work or some looking for analysis or intelligence, that a lot of that is being turned over to AI. And now it's going back and saying, like, hey, did we give it the right assumptions? Did it do what we expected? Are we good on step one, or are we good on step 100? And so that was unexpected from my perspective. And I think almost throughout the supply chain, folks are trying to find a way to use it successfully, and use it to reduce costs and hopefully get ahead of their competitors. But I would say if you're looking for a takeaway, that I think it's probably further along than maybe many of us realize, and now it's just making sure that the work is accurate, or as close to accurate as folks are willing to accept.
So we need to keep a human in the loop. Is that what I'm hearing?
Maybe a human. I think the question then is, like, what's the ratio of AI to human, and then I think that's a separate conversation.
Yeah. I'm gonna look for your program tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah.
Marjorie, do you have any thoughts on AI?
I was kind of nodding along with Mike. I think it is further along. I think when you were saying, human in the loop, I'm also thinking, well, what task? I think we're seeing a lot of the industry, they're using it in ways that are often kind of like back office or other sort of assistance to what they're doing, right? But I think that, I think all of these, the defense industry certainly is thinking through where can it assists us. And also I think they're thinking about kind of selling it to their employees as a help, not a replacement. Like, how can I make you more efficient? But I do think now there's that piece of if you give the AI more complicated work, then you need more of what Mike's talking about, more of the checks and the kind of the integrity piece of it, right? So I think there's we're all seeing it, right? That there's a lot of people using it in their daily life to complete basic tasks. And so I don't think we should expect anything different from the industries we cover. But maybe there's the kind of, as you go up that scale, there's more checks you have to put in place.
So I'm going to switch it up and focus a little bit more on defense at this point. Symposium obviously is a pretty military heavy show. And there was a lot of news around us. Of course, we're being on a wartime footing. Space is a new front line of defense. It's taking a role, certainly, in the conflict going on in Iran. What topic or announcement are y'all going to be looking for, following closely in the coming months that might have come out at the show or around the show?
I guess on my end, another area that I wanted to mention earlier of just what was surprising or most interesting at Space Symposium in particular is an increased focus and both between the Space Force and NASA on cislunar orbits, and particularly, coming off of the Artemis mission, a lot of discussion around how are we going to protect assets if we're planning to launch, multiple deployments to the moon starting in 2027. Jared Isaacman is talking about, monthly deployments there. If the Space Force is supposed to protect all U.S. assets and infrastructure in their area of responsibility, that's going to mean the moon, and it's going to mean cislunar orbits as well. So that was a big topic, is just really what is the strategy there for cislunar operations going forward. It's a huge area. It's a big area of competition. And that's why I think we saw also a lot of focus on space domain awareness as a key area of investment, not only for the US, but also for its allies. And I remember seeing a lot of announcements from companies, performing space domain awareness support, basically saying, hey, we want to let you know that we can look out all the way to cislunar with our technology. So that was an area of focus that I think is going to grow going forward.
It's very exciting.
I think the Space Force. Go ahead,
Marjorie.
I'll go after. Okay. I was thinking that, the Space Force, a lot of these things are defined by people, and I thought General Saltzman's been a really big force in how this has gone and kind of the maturation. And so, seeing who would be his successor will be a really interesting thing to watch, and how that person might kind of change the direction or shape of things. And I also think, watching that relocation, location isn't everything, but then moving to Alabama, potentially losing people. I just think that people drive these things maybe more than we think. And so watching kind of those big changes will help us understand some of the changes ahead.
Got it. Mike.
Yeah, I think there's a real emphasis right now on 2028, that there is a demand from the administration to just get things done. And I think that gets into the speed conversation we had earlier. So I'm curious about how quickly a lot of these capabilities can kind of come on board, and how quickly the acquisition part can happen. But the project where that's most evident is probably Golden Dome. So I think that's low hanging fruit. Like everyone knows that. But I do think there's still a lot of questions about how it will work, what it will look like, what's going to be a part of it, what's not. But I think that's probably going to be, the signature program, the signatures, air quote, space program for this Trump administration. And people are curious if it will be up in the timeline that the White House has said, and what it will actually do. And so there's a lot of questions around that, and I think we're going to be spending an awful lot of time there.
Hey, Rachel.
I wanted to tack on really quickly to something Marjorie said, about the move to Huntsville for SpaceCom. And it just made me think about how, talking about Golden Dome again, talking about SpaceCom moving to Huntsville, we are seeing the center of gravity, I think, for national security space kind of moving from Colorado to Alabama. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch, considering the presence of NASA also in Huntsville.
Yes.
I think we might start seeing, I was listening to a congressional hearing with the NASA leadership a couple of days ago, where members of Congress were talking about a greater national security presence within NASA as well. So just wanted to point out, I think the move to Huntsville for a variety of reasons for Golden Dome and for Spacecom is going to be interesting to track going forward.
Rachel, was there any story that you're going to be following in particular?
Yeah, one other thing in terms of defense that I would point out that I'm interested in, and Vivienne kind of started to mention this with the transport layer of the Space Development Agency, but this concept of a space data network and kind of what is it, what capabilities could be procured, how will it be used, a hybrid network with commercial systems. So to be honest, that's something I need to look into more, but it's something that I'm interested in.
So it used to be that space was all about like NASA and exploration and a little bit about military, but now military demand is really coming on strong and shaping the market. Are defense dollars accelerating innovation, distorting the market? You know, kind of what's happening? What is it in balance? Is it out of balance?
I think if I had to start, I would say that I think what's become apparent at probably a very rapid pace for this Pentagon and maybe the last couple is the potency of space capabilities and how necessary they are. I mean, these conversations go back to GPS in the early 90s, but I do think each conflict, space capabilities are being leaned on more and more. And as a result, I think that's particularly where we're seeing funding. I think obviously the U.S. has been involved in several conflicts already in 2026. And I think from everything we're being told that they're relying on commercial vendors more than they ever have. And so I think that's driving some of this, is understanding that the Department of Defense or the NRO, they might not be the best place to develop those capabilities. They may be, but there's also other folks who are doing it, and they can create something that is also very useful. So, I think it's hard to say, hey, what's driving this? I think a lot of it is, there's the defense budget's up a tremendous number over the last couple of years, but in space is obviously part of that. But I think a lot of it is this recognition that, hey, Russia and China are acting in ways that the U.S. does not find kosher, and that there's going to have to be an appropriate response to that. And that involves, to do that, it costs a lot of money. And I think that's a little bit just the evolution of the domain, and that's what we've seen in other areas. It gets expensive very quickly.
And Kathy, I feel like it's always important to note that even though, programs like the Apollo missions have been advertised and really pushed forward as scientific and exploration missions, those missions were also had a national security, reason behind it, and national security has always been like a foundational part of our space programs. I think the main difference is that historically it's been classified, and we haven't had as much of an open view of what we're investing there. And that's the big difference, is that we are actually able to see, to a certain extent, the investments that the U.S. military wants to make in the space domain. So yeah, I always just try to make sure that that's clear, because there's certainly national security space throughout all of the decades. It's not just happening now.
So which satellite imaging or ISR capabilities you think are becoming geopolitically decisive? And how much of that story may be underreported? This is not meant to be a trick question or put anyone on the spot either.
Is it all of them?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say that one is more than the other, one of methodology, but I think everything has shown how important these commercial providers are to the U.S. government and international governments. I think speed is probably one of the critical aspects of how quickly can you actually get the image and be able to collect insights and do analytics on that. Speed is probably one of the critical things. That's what I would say. I mean, I think they're all extremely important.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I think the market's probably speaking for it, right? That, we're not seeing, at least not yet, we're not seeing massive consolidation here. I think imagery constellations are an area that are frequently talked about as a target for mergers and acquisitions. But, I think intelligence agencies and governments are finding imagery constellation very, very useful. And so they're continuing to get their hands on as much as they can. And I think there's also this idea that they love being able to pick and choose, that they love being able, if one vendor doesn't have it, someone else might. And so it gives them a lot of flexibility and a lot more options to make a decision that they wouldn't have if they were only tied into one.
So I want to get around to the subject of sovereignty, because I know that's sort of been the word that's been talked about a lot. But what happens to the neutrality, quote unquote, of satellite operators if they're in supporting active terrestrial conflicts? I mean, and that again comes to this sovereignty issue. And I don't expect you guys to be solving like geopolitical challenges.
I mean, it's a little bit hypothetical, right? Like I mean, we saw an SES ground station was recently hit. I think a lot of folks point to the Viasat cyber attack, and folks will say that this level of neutrality isn't there. I remember 10 years ago, folks saying, if military data is going through commercial networks, China won't care. They will view that as a U.S. satellite. It won't make a difference if it's a military satellite or a commercial satellite. And I think that's a little bit how it's playing out. And so I think the neutrality aspect of that is probably, maybe something that's a little more academic than in reality. I think the sovereignty discussion is probably a different one. I think the sovereignty discussion is more based on the idea that there are questions and doubts about how much you can count on your allies, and governments are, looking pretty hard to have their own capabilities and to have their own systems. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the spending, particularly in Europe.
Vivienne, any thoughts on that?
I would say, based on the question you asked, my thought immediately went to this Space Force initiative right now called the Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve. And that's really getting to the active discussion that you're saying right now. But I was hedging my bets on how to respond because, we just don't really know. They don't really know how, what's going to happen if you have commercial operators, for example, kind of surging capacity during wartime. The questions around what insurance guarantees can we provide to those operators, that's still really under discussion. So it probably depends on the mission area as well. That's kind of what's been happening with this CASR initiative. I think the Space Force initially thought the most viable opportunity would be in the satellite communications area. And those operators have been very cautious about engaging in the CASR initiative. I mean, they've been in discussions, but they ultimately have moved ahead with space domain awareness providers, for example. And I think that, change kind of shows, again, it's tough for these operators to really trust that their assets will be protected in a significant way. So all that to say, it's just a very active area of discussion right now, and we'll just have to see. But to Mike's point, I think the best example of the sovereign investment is more Starlink turning off, service over Ukraine. And that's the big concern in Europe, and really driving that investment there.
Outside the US and China, which countries or regional blocks do you think are making the most moves towards a sovereign capability? And are we overlooking any of that? Or is the public overlooking?
I mean, we've seen a ton of momentum in Europe, which, like Vivienne said, of Europe deciding that they're overly reliant on Starlink and they don't want to be overly reliant. But you can't just put up another Starlink immediately. It's something that takes a lot of time. And it's not just SATCOM investment. We saw a lot of European countries in the past year purchase Earth observation satellites for themselves, that they want to have their own capabilities in both EO and SATCOM. So I think that's absolutely a trend. And I think the Middle East should also be mentioned in terms of sovereign. There have been a couple of sovereign SATCOM orders in the Middle East in the past few months. And that's nations wanting to know that they have dedicated SATCOM capabilities that are going to be just for them.
Marjorie?
And I do think we've danced around this topic a little bit, but it would be, I think we'd be remiss to talk about sovereign capabilities and not address the launcher shortage that we're still seeing after many, many years. I mean, as much as Europe might want to launch their own sovereign satellites, they are still dependent on SpaceX and some Aviaspace, rockets to get those capabilities up. And I think until other countries and alliances are able to launch their own satellites, they're waiting on ISAR, for example. That's going to be a big concern and issue with really getting more sovereign systems up and running.
I was just reading this morning about I think it's called Maya Space. Yes. It's maybe a new division of Arianespace that's going to be.
It's an Ariane group startup that they're targeting smaller launch. But again, it's a couple years out there in development, and that's the thing with all these small sat launchers in development. It's in some cases it's been years and years of development and still haven't launched.
Space is hard, as they say. I'm sorry, Marjorie, were you going to add something there?
No, this hasn't been an issue we're tracking closely.
Okay, thank you. So are we seeing a shift from space for all to first come, first served? I mean, how do non-spacefaring nations, how are they going to see that or experience that? And again, this is just educated perspective. I mean, if I'm a small African nation, I'm kind of at the mercy of, do you want to be at the mercy of a mega constellation provider? Do you want to have your own, what does that mean for people's day to day?
I think that's a huge question. And does every nation have equal rights to access space if they can? Is there a worry that, I think that some have a worry that space will be used up before they can get there, that there will be so many things deployed that there won't be orbital positions or spectrum availability. Like space, it is a finite resource. So I definitely don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a really interesting question. It's something that I've definitely heard concerns from folks about.
I've never thought of space as a finite resource before, but now I will, especially orbital paths. Yeah, because it's getting crowded.
Positions and spectrum availability.
Yeah, no, it's getting very crowded for sure. I'm sorry, does anyone else have a thought on that they wanted to comment? No? Okay. Oh, then I know we've been wanting to talk about spectrum. It's come up a few times. So what story in spectrum policy do you think needs the most attention right now?
Okay, I can start with that. I mean, so what we've seen in the last few months has been demand and interest around mobile satellite sort of MSS spectrum, which is that can be used, like it can be used in for direct to device, and you don't need to work with the MNO and operate in their spectrum. It's already authorized for satellite services. Some of the spectrum is globally harmonized, so it is very valuable. We saw EchoStar sell their spectrum to SpaceX, and then Amazon purchasing Globalstar for really for that MSS spectrum. Satellites will still have to be built to, for the next generation systems. They'll still have to launch new assets to use some of that spectrum. And then that's also created kind of a bump in interest at Iridium and Viasat, which also have a good chunk of MSS spectrum. But then the question that comes next is, okay, so can you justify the value of what you paid for it? Are you able to deliver services that are going to bring in the revenue to justify that price that you paid? So that's the question that will be, yes, you can say the spectrum is so valuable because it's scarce, but can you deliver services that are going to realize that value?
Yeah. Other thoughts?
And from the military space side, I think spectrum already was a critical resource, but it is becoming even more important as the Space Force invests more in electronic warfare capabilities. As we've been hearing from the Pentagon about Operation Epic Fury, there's been a lot of sort of lauding of space capabilities, kind of references from the CENTCOM commander and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But really the area that they've been able to talk somewhat publicly about is electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing that's happening in that operation area. And we even see in the Space Force budgets that there's a huge investment in electronic warfare capabilities, both defensive and offensive. So just to reinforce that in the military area, spectrum is going to become more of a desired asset as well.
Okay. We've talked about we've already covered launch. That was one of the things that I wanted to talk about. But yes, it is becoming very much a bottleneck, I think, and we're trying to build up that capability more. Is the how do you balance covering like the technical leap? I mean, Starship and SpaceX, to their credit, they're doing some amazing things. Is there a way to cover that without sort of becoming an unpaid PR monopoly? I mean, kind of where's the balance in covering what are some pretty incredible accomplishments?
I mean, there's always ways to cover things without becoming an unpaid PR consultant, I promise. We at Aerospace America, we really like to focus on the technical, and we like to focus on technical achievements. And I think we just make sure that technical achievements are real, right? Like you need to talk to outside sources who can verify that this is an actual leap forward. We generally like to see that there's an investment that's being made either by a government agency or by a large company that thinks this is worth purchasing. I mean, people generally don't buy things that they don't think are real per se. So we are always looking for things that are leaps, but we are not here to applaud them. We're here to write about how they did it, how they work, and what's next. So I mean, I think that's just part of being a good journalist, is making sure that you're validating it, and also we're not here to cheerlead, but we are here to report.
Fair point. Thank you.
I think a lot of times in space too, there's moving deadlines, moving targets, and I think we've seen that, in particular with Starship, where it's been, hey, 4 more weeks, 6 more weeks, 4 more weeks, 6 more weeks, and I think, we have readers that are frustrated when we say that, and they say, well, why don't you guys go build a spaceship? And it's like, that's not the point. The point is that, we want to accurately and objectively write about, what companies say they're going to do for the space industry. And there's lots of reasons for that. And so I think when companies meet those deadlines, we write about it, and when they, but in part that's expected because they said they were going to do it, and when they don't, we write about it as well because that's also part of the game. And so, I think that's one way to kind of stay honest about what our coverage looks like.
Perfect. Thank you. So there's a lot of discussion about a brain drain coming out of legacy aerospace and moving into this kind of exciting new space market. What are your thoughts on the talent pool? Is it deep enough to be doing all of these things? Are we going to be heading for engineering bottlenecks? How do we skill people up faster?
It's a lot of money, right? I mean, there's a lot of money in this industry right now. I know we've written about at least two, and I'm probably missing at least one, space unicorns this year, companies with more than $1 billion in valuation that aren't publicly traded yet. There's, a giant IPO coming, supposedly next month.
Really?
That's gonna change a lot of people's lives and finances, and a lot of people in the space industry. And so I think there's a couple of things that people say when they think about this. One is that there's a passion and people do it because they love it and they are passionate about space. Okay, that's great. I think there's also a lot of money to be made for a lot of people, and that's a pretty good motivator too. And I think between the two of those, I don't think there's going to be a dearth of people wanting to go into the space industry. I think the bigger issue just could be, the quality of engineer and just, or the quality of the worker. But I think that's probably something that's happening throughout the workforce right now. So, I don't expect there to be a shortage. We're also seeing more and more people move into the space industry that weren't there 5 or 10 years ago. So, not to be so capitalist about it, but if there's money there, I think the jobs will be there and the people will be there as well.
Other perspectives?
I feel like there's this fear like 10, 15 years ago from the defense industry that no one would come because they all wanted to go to Google or Facebook or, these tech companies. And, maybe it was a problem for a little bit, but I also think tech has had its own. I mean, we see layoffs constantly in the tech industry. And I think that, the defense industry and potentially space industry too can see that as a possible kind of area to take some people. So, I hear less about that kind of fear. And I think also there is this, money is obviously one draw, as Mike's saying. I also think when there's excitement around an area, when people are watching things like Artemis or, Artemis 3 in a year, that kind of helps draw people too, right? They see something and they say, I want to do that.
Yeah, I think hard tech is really cool right now. And people, you can build something in space and see it go up and say, I built that. And in space, people are building hardware. And yes, AI, it might assist in that process, but we do need people for the very real manufacturing in the space industry. So like Marjorie had said, it was something that I had covered a little bit more in depth a couple of years ago. And I know that a lot of people are hiring, and looking for the right talent is a challenge, but I'm not hearing from people that they can't find those people and that there's a dearth or a gap for talent.
Vivienne?
And the last 2 cents I'll just put on that is I've seen several companies now, especially, I'm based in Los Angeles. Long Beach is really trying to position itself as the space beach, as like an alternative to the Space Coast in Florida. And there are a lot of initiatives here with companies sort of supporting feeder systems, essentially with local high schools and colleges, to try and get that talent pool going from a young age. So from what everyone else just said, I think from the engineering and the hard tech standpoint, that that pipeline seems to be very healthy. The two main areas of the workforce that I hear the most struggles with are, as Rachel was just referencing, machinists, manufacturing, skilled trade workers is still a huge issue for a lot of companies. But then also on the Space Force side, the contracting officers have been severely hit over the past couple of years thanks to DOGE and just other areas of government cuts. And that's a big area. If all these companies want government contracts, but there aren't enough people to move those contracts through, then that money is going to get held up somewhere. So I think instead, like, the engineers are fine, it seems like, and there's enough to go around, but there are definitely areas of shortage within the workforce.
It sounds like there's good opportunities for people to skill up, though, on those kind of more technical, tactile trade capabilities, and the same in shipbuilding. So, well, let's bring all that back. So we're getting tight on time. I have two more questions that I really would like to cover if we can. We are in such a different world with this market so quickly. What has changed the most for each of you as a journalist covering this space, say in the last 2 to 3 years? Rachel, let's start with you.
Sure. I'll go a little bit more on the SATCOM side. I would say the tie-in with the terrestrial, like mobile network industry, and how that is getting more and more closely tied in with satellite has been the biggest change. I'm covering those. There's more overlap. I'm having to. Spectrum has always been of interest in the satellite industry, but in terms of just this convergence of what people refer to as satellite and terrestrial worlds, that's been the biggest change that I've seen in the last few years, and that's had implications for my coverage.
Marjorie?
Well, I recently switched into this particular role. So honestly, it's been more my move than maybe the market, but I think I've been really interested to learn more about the commercial space market and see the maturity of it. It's just been really, I don't want to say shocking, but I've been very surprised by how far along it is, and I've learned a lot about it in my time here. So still kind of figuring out some parts of it, but that's been really interesting to see and kind of understanding how and where that affects the military space side of things.
Vivienne, how about you?
I mean, really, it comes down to just the more openness about military space capabilities and budgets and so forth than we've ever seen before. Like, the anecdote I like to use is 5-6 years ago, before the Space Force was a thing, we would go to briefings with the then Air Force Space Command Chief, General J. Raymond, who then became the first Chief of Space Operations. But there would be one space-related briefing for the entire Air Force, command structure, and he would barely be able to say anything at all to us. We'd ask questions, and it would just, they would just kind of brush us off. And now, you go to conferences, and you have 6, 7, 8 briefings just with U.S. Space Force commanders who still will, not say everything that you would like them to say, but it's still just so much more information that we've ever been able to have access to, and just subject matter experts, quite frankly, within the U.S. military that we have been able to ask questions to. So that has been a significant change, and I hope that continues and improves.
Great, thank you. Mike?
I would say, to Vivienne's point too, that there are a lot more reporters interested in space. Personally, when I started covering national security space in 2013, I believe I was the only person whose full-time job it was to cover military space. Now I think there's 4 or 5 folks, and a whole, maybe another half dozen who do it part-time. So I think the number of people who are interested, particularly in the national security side, but also just in the space industry, the space community at large has grown. I think a lot of that just has to do with the size of the market, and people need that business intelligence. So I think that's probably the number one change.
Okay. And in the 1 minute we have left, could you each give me one prediction for the next year that you think would surprise non-experts in this field?
I'm going to make
I
a
say
bold
I really
prediction
don't like to prognosticate as a reporter.
Okay, that's fair. Mike, go ahead.
I'm going to say, and since no one's going to hold me to it, I can be bolder, but I'll say that the number of launches in 2026 will be not significantly different from 2025.
Very interesting. Okay. Rachel or Marjorie, are you comfortable prognosticating?
Yeah, this isn't that spicy, but I think that adoption of direct to device will continue to be a little bit lukewarm, lackluster.
Thank you.
The last time I tried to prognosticate, I said that Elon Musk would not have a big role in Trump's new administration. So I was clearly wrong about that. And that's why I don't want to predict anything else.
Your perspectives and your experience are invaluable. Thank you so much for sharing them with us today. We appreciate you. And I also want to give a big thank you to our co-sponsors for this event. And thanks to everybody who joined us to listen in. And we'll see you out there. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thanks, Juan. Thank you.
Thank you.